Today, we just want to have a little bit of a discussion around technology as a key and strategic driver for economic development.
Thank you so much, Nkemdilim. It's my pleasure to be on the panel. My name is Soromfe. I work for Microsoft. I work for a team within Microsoft referred to as the For Africa team or the Africa Initiatives team. And our basic responsibility is market development on the continent. So looking to meet long-term investments that we believe are critical to the potential that we see on the continent.
So we'll maybe start with my first question. And that sort of, I want us to sort of frame, sort of what are the key economic growth drivers in Africa currently, right? And how can technology policy strategically help with driving this growth? So, just taking that really holistic view of the continent, or you can specifically speak to any country that, you have a lot of knowledge about, but what are those policies and, sort of what are those key economic drivers that we need to be really looking and tracking?
So as in thinking through the questions and thinking through how best to answer them, I tried not to get any specific information in any particular country because it's very easy for these conversations to very quickly segue into a Nigeria conversation or South African conversation or Egypt conversation. When we talk about key economic growth, obviously there are a number of different pillars that people would look at. But I think from my perspective, the ones that jump out at me are one, the population growth, the working population growth that we see on the continent currently. And this, to me, is a very critical demographic shift that has the potential to create wealth, enormous wealth for the continent, but could also be a ticking time bomb. And it's a conversation that I think that leaders on the continent need to begin to have in a very strategic way. The second pillar there to me from an economic growth perspective is regional trade. And I know that we've just launched the AFC, FTA, and all of that. But there is also the conversation around, it's one thing to sign a document. It's another thing to actually go ahead and implement what the document asks you to implement. A very obvious paradox, and I guess I can say this since I'm Nigerian, is the fact that we sort of have our borders closed and we've just signed the AFCFTA, which is a bit of a paradox when you compare the two together. And then the third pillar is what I would probably refer to as the imperative for both diversification of African economies. Diversification perspective, obviously, because Africa has been resource rich for a long time, it hasn't necessarily been successful, but African economies have been able to get by on just extracting resources and selling them into the global markets. Unfortunately, that hasn't taken us too far and is definitely not going to take us much further than it has at the moment. And then obviously, when you talk about value addition, whether we're talking about the extractive industries or we're referring to agriculture, there's a conversation to be had around what do we need to do as a continent to make sure that we're deriving the most value from the things that we provide to the global economy. So if you ask me for the key economic drivers, that's what will come to mind immediately, as to say, these are the things that I think that we need to begin to think through as a continent in solving the challenges that we know are here and the potential that we think that we have.
Okay, great. So how does technology policy strategically drive those key economic areas that you've identified? So you've mentioned, sort of diversification of the economy, and you've mentioned areas like agriculture and, sort of the value add and that value chain that, sort of goes into actual processing of these, of the agricultural produce and, sort of then exporting of that as opposed to constantly importing, right? But agriculture, technology, for a lot of people, those two things are sort of very, very far apart. So how does technology policy really start influencing all these different areas of the economy?
So in answering that question, I think I'll approach it in a number of ways. The first one would be to look at it at a micro level. So I'll tell a very simple story about, a farmer and a farm, a real story, and then look at it at the macro level. But before I talk, before I start to answer those questions, because Obviously, some of these answers include things that are as interesting as artificial intelligence, data analysis, and those are very quick to see. But there was something you mentioned in your introduction where you talked about um, policy starting sometimes with talent and infrastructure. So when you talk about technology in the African context, there is a tendency to want to have the more complicated conversations of artificial intelligence, of leading edge manufacturing and things like that. But we all know that on the continent, we need to start with the very basics, power, for instance, and that's technology too. So there's that conversation first at that level. And then there are things as basic as connectivity, which is still a challenge on the continent. Now, where policy comes in is how, as African economies, are we looking to solve even these very basic challenges? And when you look at power, there are conversations around um, solar power, for instance, to be able to get small farms to run and things like that. There are conversations around mini grids, smaller grids, and that type of conversation, unlocking investment capital, in it, creating an enabling environment for people to be open to making these long-term investments, for instance. So there are those conversations to be had, and that's where the policy really comes in to protect the investors that drive those areas. And then you layer on top of that the connectivity bit. And yes, we have this great, amazing story of how Africa leapfrogged the world and became the place where mobile technology took off, so to say. But we still look at the numbers and we see that there is still an enormous opportunity to get people online and to give people access to the internet. Now, the large telco companies have the challenge of knowing that to set up their current technology infrastructure in certain areas would be cost prohibitive, because if you think of your typical rural area, your hilly rural areas, where there are a lot of, well, you have your agriculture, you have people working in the rural space who actually need connectivity but are unable to get it because it doesn't make sense for a telco to make that investment. One of the things that you begin to consider is, how do we as a continent begin to adopt new technologies that help us to solve that problem? For instance, TV white spaces. So Microsoft and a couple of other large organizations have come together to work on initiatives like that. There are about 5 or 6 that I'm currently involved in, where we're driving the adoption of TV white space. TV white space is basically um, the usage of the TV spectrum that initially was used for analog analog TV transmission, but now can be repurposed for data. And that's the basic idea of it. And that technology is much cheaper. As more people adopt it, they're driving down the equipment costs. And that's something that can easily go to rural areas. You can have 1 or 2 masts in a village. It's really cheap to set up. It's these type of conversations and the regulatory framework around it that enables both the small companies that are driving this type of initiatives and the large telcos to understand that this is a win-win situation for everybody. So when you talk about the policies involved, for instance, that's where policy comes in. How are we thinking about the power challenge on the continent? What structures are we putting in place to allow the necessary capital flow to support that? How are we thinking about connectivity on the continent? How are we supporting new innovative technologies that solve or fix that gap? And then when I talked about, giving an example of a small story. I once visited a farm, I don't know, maybe about 3 hours outside of Nairobi, and the farmer on that farm had an irrigation system. That irrigation system was connected to solar power, and transmitted data from his farm to the central company. Now that entire technology system was leased out to the farmer on the basis of information that they had received from him. And one of the interesting things that when you begin to see solutions like this is that they're really simple, they're really cheap, and as long as an enabling environment is created for these, there are entrepreneurs willing to pursue these opportunities on the continent. I hope that gives a bit of a broad view of
Yes,
the
I think
areas that
it's a really, really great overview because you've covered so many different aspects of, sort of the really core problems on the continent that are very different than the problems that we see in the developing world. And obviously it means that we have to have sort of tailored solutions, right? And that sort of brings me to 2 points, right? So the first point is, so you spoke about, sort of the enabling policies, right? And in Nigeria, we've recently, sort of seen that there are a few state governments who have slashed the right-of-way charges and reduced taxes for building the last mile, right? And I think that this is something that we've been advocating for about 10 years here in Nigeria, but COVID accelerated that being put into action because suddenly they realized, well, now the people who are in the rural areas or outside of the big cities don't have access to internet, so they can't be homeschooled. They're going to fall behind by a year or more in their education simply because of that. Government can't, work efficiently because there's no connectivity in the big cities. So I think those are really sort of key, sort of policy shifts that we're seeing. So the two things that I want to ask you, the first one is, what is sort of the biggest policy technology policy shift or development that you've seen anywhere on the continent, right? And which country do you think is sort of leading technology policy on the continent? And then the second question, sort of goes around, that tailored approach that you've sort of mentioned or implied in your response, right? Where you've sort of said, we need to look at the actual problems and build policies that create enabling environments so that those problems can be solved, and they will be solved by ensuring that, there's access to finance and investment coming into the space, right? They'll be solved by there being entrepreneurs that can, launch their companies, grow their companies, and have access to different types of resources or tax breaks, right? Those are all policies that affect every single sector, because you've, clearly stated how the technology entrepreneurship sector and the tech space really interplay with every single sector of the economy by providing these data-driven and IoT-driven and new technology-driven solutions, right? So in Africa, across board, we see a lot of sort of copy and paste when it comes to technology policy development, right? So I've reviewed quite a lot of technology policies, especially here in Nigeria. And, like you always know, like, oh, this is from the Indian technology policy. This they grabbed from Estonia. This was grabbed from somewhere else, right? And I think that model just can't work, right? We need tailored policies that suit our nations and are aligned with our development. So how do we move away from that copy and paste approach? And how do we also ensure that actual policy makers and the people who create these policies have the right type of knowledge, right, to ensure that we're getting the best of the best that is tailored to our solutions? So I know a lot of questions.
Yes, but I'll try, and I think it's a conversation, so you would always pull me back to anything that I have missed. But, off of the last point that you made, I made a note when I was preparing to say, and apologies to career public servants, but you can't have a career public servant draw up policy for the startup ecosystem. It's just not going to work. And no matter how well-intentioned the person is, it's just not the way to go about it. And I think that's the first place to start. In drawing up technology policy, I think any policy actually, but let's stick to technology policy. It's important to have people with skin in the game at the table making the final decisions, because at the end of the day, we are all certain that no one will shoot themselves in the foot. So if you ask the people who bear the brunt of those policies to sit down and put together a cohesive policy, they will do it. That's one thing. The second thing, and I don't want to mention particular instances, but I have seen this on the continent, I've also seen it in Nigeria here, is that I think that with policy, it is best to allow an open field where we are not sure, and to allow the players in that field to craft out the structure for that field. Because when we begin to just put in policies because we think all the areas should be covered, we end up with a situation where people are stifled, where innovation is stifled, and we're not getting the right outcomes at the end of the day. Sometimes, and if you look at a bit of the history of technology advancement, even in the developed world, you would find that people reached beyond um, even what anyone was thinking. And then it's after they've sort of developed it, it's like there's a tech company where it's almost like go in there and break it. And then when the government says you've gone too far, then stop. So for me, the mindset around policy development should be one, make sure that people with skin in the game are at the table, and that if they are not the ones making the final decision, they should have a very, very strong say um, in that final decision around that space. And I think when we talk about this tailored approach versus the copy and paste approach, sometimes, and we have this challenge sometimes, not sometimes, quite a bit on the continent, when people try to come up with very new, innovative, Afrocentric policies, they end up making mistakes that someone who's done it somewhere else can quickly point out to them. So there's a bit of it's a merging of the two. If it's been done somewhere else, we should be able to take a look at it and understand why it was done there, the context in which it was done, and what the lessons from doing it that way are. Um, I think what you're speaking to is the literal copy and paste approach, which is where that context isn't taken into consideration. There isn't really any intellectual debate or consideration around why things are the way they are, and somebody just slaps it onto a document and gets it signed, and everybody begins to shout. So I think that if something has been done somewhere, we should learn from it. I think it's important to learn from it. There is no sense in trying to reinvent the wheel. That's the first thing. However, in doing that, that's where the first part comes into play. If you get people with skin in the game into the room to take a look at that policy, then they can give you the context to say, I understand that this was done in India or in South Africa or in Europe or in Estonia, but in the Nigerian context, this would not work for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 reasons. Here are the tweaks that we need to make to it to be able to land it in market. And let's come back a year later to look at it and see how we've done. That sort of conversation. I think you then asked, what country do I think with regards to technology policy is way ahead, right?
Yes,
Um,
sort of like what is the biggest thing that they've sort of done that you feel like, wow, this was a step in the right direction and should be sort of adopted and, sort of like also taken on board by other African countries?
I don't have an answer to that question. I don't have an answer to that question, and I'll tell you why. Um, I think that there are a number of African countries that are headed in the right direction, having the right conversations. I mentioned TV white spaces when I started to talk, and we're talking to a number of governments around it. Some of them have implemented, some have signed, and all of that. So that's commendable. There are conversations around power and infrastructure that are essential. There are conversations around enabling the startup ecosystem. You've talked about tax rebates and things like that. Um, there are conversations I would like to see the countries on the continent begin to have. One of the things that I wanted to mention to you, and maybe it's in one of your questions ahead, I don't know, but there's a global demand for certain skills. And I think that Africa is positioned in exactly the right place, not just from the burgeoning youth population, but also from our geographic location, where basically GMT plus 2 to GMT minus 2 or something like that. So that allows us to be able to service, both the Eastern Hemisphere in a sense and the Western Hemisphere in a sense. So I think that there's a huge potential there. I would love to see a concerted, coordinated, almost strategic and tactical approach to ensuring that we're able to partake in that economy. There are a number of different ways to partake in the digital economy. I had a conversation, I think, earlier in the month with a group of people around it. So yes, we can, it's either we're the ones setting up the big Facebooks and Microsoft of the world ourselves, but we don't have the financial markets to be able to support that. We don't have the investment structures to be able to support that. We could be trying to launch startups and then selling them off to the bigger companies. Paystack would be a good example of that. And maybe we're able to do that, but how many of that can we really do? Even if we did 100 a year, does that really solve the challenge that we have on the continent? But there is the bit around skills, and skills is a really, really low hanging fruit. There is a demand for software engineers everywhere. There's a demand, and obviously with the pandemic, the idea of remote working or working in a different location has sort of become commonplace. So it's almost like a number of factors have come together to give us this window of opportunity that may not last more than 3 to 5 years. And I think that that's one area, one policy area that I think that our national governments need to start to think strategically about and address quickly.
Yeah, so I mean, digital skills is one of my, sort of favorite areas to sort of talk about and really look at. And I did some research last year in Nigeria, where I looked at sort of the digital skills landscape and who actually creates that talent pipeline and where that talent goes, right? And what we saw is that a lot of the talent actually goes outside of the country, right? So it gets trained and then goes outside of the country. But what happens is that our talent pipeline is so small. So we now recruit talent from other countries. So we have people from India building our software. We have people from Estonia building our software, right? And that ecosystem and that talent pipeline really needs to be broadened. And this is something that, sort of goes across the continent. And what we saw during the pandemic, when suddenly the borders were shut and the airports were closed, right? Engineers couldn't fly in anymore to come and service. And that is when local companies suddenly said, well, we need to sort of look at what do we do. And I think that that is an area, like you said, that it has so much potential. And we're seeing some companies like Tech Expert who have sort of set up base in Nigeria and are setting up in Rwanda. We've seen companies like Andela take a stab at that. Obviously, they've sort of changed their business model a little bit, but I think like the government really needs to create that enabling environment, and with that, actually, you've answered the last question that I had, which was sort of, what would be one policy recommendation that you would make to ensure that we, sort of become competitive. So since you've answered the question already and we're actually out of time, I'm going to wrap up here. And thank you for the amazing discussion.
Thank you very much.
You weren't prepared to answer. But I really want to thank you for making this very, very interesting and really so generously sharing your knowledge around this topic, and sort of from the experience and explaining the entire sort of policy value chain and how policy comes into play in economic development. So thank you very much. As we wrap up, I think that what we've touched on is that we need to have policy that focuses on the use of data. We need policy that focuses on identity management on the continent, policies that really look at those emerging technologies like IoT, AI, blockchain, and create an enabling environment for technology adoption. And obviously, the foundation for that is really the democratization of the internet and ensuring that everyone has access and ensuring that we really solve that problem around connectivity and that last mile issue that we still see in a lot of countries. We also need to have policies that really protect investors, both foreign investors and local investors. And I think also policies that ensure that there is more local investment going on so that the ownership of the technology that we build on the continent really stays on the continent and does not get offshored, and then we become consumers of that technology again, right? So protecting the investors and creating an enabling environment for local investment to grow in the technology space. And then obviously you mentioned, sort of the key importance of really learning from other countries and adopting policies and adapting them to the local environment, as opposed to just saying, oh yeah, this looks like a good policy, let's copy and paste. So with that, thank you very much for everyone that has participated today. This has been a great discussion. Thank you, Soromfe, so much for.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.